On the Way Home is proudly supported by Ellis Don Community Builders, a group formed within the Ellis Don group of companies to assist those who wish to deliver affordable and sustainable housing by providing development management services and leveraging Ellis Don's turnkey cradle-to-grave project capabilities. We incorporate all that a world-leading development, construction, and building services company has to offer to provide innovative and sustainable developments that connect and energize communities. Our offering is not simply a development and construction solution. It's a holistic and comprehensive approach that ensures the delivery of assets that communities can be proud of. To learn more, please visit www.communitybuilders.ellisdon.com.
We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day. Another episode of On the Way Home podcast. I am your co-host, Stefania Secha from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And with me, as always, is the stoic, legendary, wonderful Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. I finally get to reverse everything, Michael. But how are things going for you guys over in Ontario?
Well, when you did that intro, I was actually looking around to see if someone else was joining us. But who? That's exciting.
Right? It makes you feel good. It's a good affirmation to start with.
It is feeling standing tall or sitting tall. But I'll tell you something, so we all know this is our first podcast that we're recording in 2022. Mm-hmm. With the pandemic surging at just the worst possible time during the holidays when people were off. And so it's been quite challenging, and I'm sure it will continue to be. But man, I am so fortunate to work with such a good team. They've stepped up. They continue to do that. They're just so passionate and loyal to our most vulnerable. So it's pretty inspiring. So how can I complain when they're doing life-saving work? So it's pretty great. How about CAH? What's going on?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Omicron, and I don't know if I'm saying it right out the gate. It's one of those things you read over and over again. And I think right now our big focus is knocking on the doors of the federal government and provincial governments and health leaders, because I think we're kind of almost a little bit scarily back to square one in March 2020, where we're running low on PPE. Now we need N95 masks because they're the best against this new variant. I think the big ticket is getting that funding back, as we've lost sort of those isolation spaces that we had for some time in many communities across the country. We need to kind of get things back in order, because it's really going to hit the most vulnerable population, folks who are out on the street, not to mention that it's winter. So I think our big concern is helping those burnt out frontline workers who are just like hanging on and doing incredible work, keeping people safe. So that's kind of where we're at. But speaking of some incrediable people working out there right now, maybe we can introduce our two awesome guests that I'm really excited to have a chat with today.
Yeah, that's a good segue. And we started this podcast on such a downer note. So let's have some positive energy, and these two individuals absolutely are bringing that. No pressure. So first, I'm going to introduce, and if it sounds like I'm reading it, it's because I am, because these people are so awesome. They have done a lot. There's no way I can memorize all this. So we have Isabel Casante, Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation at the United Way, Greater Toronto. So Isabel has over 20 years of research, evaluation, and program management experience in academia and the non-for-profit sector. Currently, in her role as Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation with the United Way of Greater Toronto, Isabel is responsible for developing and implementing the organization's research and evaluation strategies based on strong evidence base, a commitment to addressing systemic discrimination, and a solid foundation of partnerships and relationships. Isabel believes strongly in collaborative learning and leadership and the need to integrate the strengths and perspectives of all stakeholders involved She holds a B.Ed from the University of Regina, a BA and MA from the University of Calgary. And, if that wasn't enough, she's also a PhD in Literature and Cultural Studies from the University of Toronto. Dr. Isabel, welcome. And we also have the amazing Trisha Scantlebury, who's the Senior Manager of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation at the United Way, Greater Toronto. Trisha has over 10 years experience leading research and policy studies while working collaboratively with the nonprofit, public and private sectors. Trisha currently oversees research committed to housing policy, specifically how it strengthens the social infrastructure with low-income tower communities. And we're going to hear more about that coming up. She's held various roles with the United Way since 2015, focusing on immigration policy while identifying ways to better coordinate formal and informal services to strengthen immigrant and newcomer communities. Awesome. Trisha volunteers with the multi-service community agency Sistering. Sistering's awesome. Way to go, Trisha. And which supports socially isolated women and trans people who are unhoused or precariously housed in Toronto. Trisha holds a BA from York University and an MA in Sociology and International Development from the University of Guelph. Isabel and Trisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you folks and learn more, about the report you're working on. But before we kind of dive into that, we've been asking all of our guests this first question, and the two of you are the first ones to answer it for us in this new year. And that question is, what does home mean to you? And Trisha, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having us. We're really, really excited to be here with you. So when I think about home, I really think about it as a place that should be providing us with a ton of comfort and should be offering us stability. It should be a place where our children can play and where they can feel happy, whether they're inside or outside, where families can gather comfortably, have tons of space. Definitely it should be a place that's also affordable. Our home should bring us, we should be happy there. They should be places where we know that we can thrive, where we're protected from the cold that we're experiencing right now in Toronto, especially heat, from really damp weather and other potential threats. We also know that when we're thinking about home, or when I'm thinking about home, I'm thinking about my surrounding community. So I'm thinking about the neighbors down the street who might need some help and support. I'm thinking about teachers and friends and how they all really play a part on how I think about my community, about that's home to me. So it's more than just a physical structure. It's more than just a commodity. It really helps shape so much of my identity, and I think it reflects a lot of who we want to be and who we are. So that's how I think about home. We'll just turn it over to Isabel.
Sure. I'll start by saying I've never spent so much time at home as I have over the past couple of years, as I'm sure many of us are in the same boat. And so really when I think of home these days, it's everything. It's, of course, shelter, the sense of identity that Trisha was talking about. It's also work. It's also school. I've got a couple kids on their computers right now. It's the playground, the movie theater. It's just really everything right now. And so I'm so grateful that I have a home that's safe, that's warm, and that meets my needs and my family's needs.
Great answers. And I've really come to love this question because I think it's just such a wonderful way to kind of break the ice of the interview and the conversation. So thank you both. And so as I noted, we're sort of asked you to come on today to talk about this new report United Way released called Vertical Legacy. Great name, by the way. A case for revitalizing the GTA's aging rental tower communities, which I think is a problem in a lot of our major aging cities. So can you talk to us a little bit about why this research was important for the United Way to do, and what was the process?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Stefania, for the question. I'm going to start with a little bit of background just to help listeners understand some of the context behind the report. This was conceptualized initially as a 10-year follow-up or an update to a report that we released 10 years ago called Vertical Poverty by Postal Code. And that report presented new data, certainly new at the time, looking at the growing concentrations of poverty, spatial concentrations of poverty in the city of Toronto's inner suburban neighborhoods. And it really highlighted the connection between poverty and poor housing conditions at a neighborhood level, particularly in these privately owned high-rise rental towers. in these suburban neighborhoods. And so vertical poverty was really instrumental because it noted this trend towards these like spatial geographic concentrations of poverty, but also because it emphasized the assets of these high-rise buildings and these high-rise towers for the city and for renters, particularly low to moderate income renters. So fast forward 10 years, and amidst not only a heightened regional housing supply and affordability crisis, but also a global pandemic that began to really expose the deep-seated structural inequities embedded in our systems and our policies and our institutions, including, of course, our housing systems and our health systems. We began asking ourselves what had changed over the past 10 years since we'd led that original piece of research, and were we still seeing the same concentrations of poverty in these communities? Had conditions improved or had they deteriorated? I mean, we're like everybody, we've been tracking the data, so we had a hunch that things had gotten worse, and that we were seeing the increasing cost of housing and across the GTA, but really across the country as well. And so we really wanted to learn more about who was living in these tower communities. We knew, again, there was a lot that we knew. We knew there were large pockets of racialized and immigrant renters living in these towers, but that wasn't really quite enough knowledge, because one thing that we have learned through COVID is the importance of disaggregated data to help us see some of these underlying patterns of representations or over-representations in some cases. So we thought, well, maybe we can get some disaggregated race-based data on residents to see who was overrepresented in these towers. We wanted also from a policy perspective to understand what levers we could be pulling to help address some of the challenges faced by tower residents. And finally, we also wanted to expand the geography to a regional picture across the GTA with a focus of Peel, Toronto, and York region. Were Peel and York region towers experiencing the same challenges? Were they deteriorating in the same way? Were there similar trends towards this like ethnocultural spatial segregation and segregation of poverty really within these towers? And so we had lots of questions. To help us think through these questions, we reached out to our partners. We were working with David Hulchansky's shop at the Neighborhood Change Research Partnership out of U of T, as well as the Tower Renewal Partnership, headed by Graham Stewart, who you probably know. And the Tower Renewal Partnership had been really piloting tower renewal solutions, and they've been doing that work for over a decade. So in a sense, it was really a kind of a dream team, dream partnerships. And so we started, trying to scope out some of the questions and try to answer some of the questions. And as you know, if you've ever done research, it's a long process and it's a winding road, which can be really frustrating. I was going to say sometimes, but I think always. And so as we were in the process of the research throughout, some key principles really began to emerge, and that helped us guide development of the report. The first one, as we began to analyze and make sense of the income and ethnocultural diversity data, which really showed growing income disparities between people renting in towers and other renters and homeowners. And then when we looked at the racial, like the ethnocultural data, we saw that racialized people, and in particular Black, Filipino, and South Asian communities, as we started to look at the disaggregated data, and immigrant communities, of course, were most likely not only to live in towers, but to live in towers in low-income neighborhoods. And so as we began processing this, it became obvious that we really needed to go back to the framing of the report and frame it squarely within an equity and human rights lens. So we had to really center the report on the premise that housing is a human right, and that all people, regardless of income or racial or ethnic background, deserve to live in dignity, in decent, secure, affordable housing. And so the report digs into how the affordable housing crisis really converges with these broader social and structural inequities, and including, of course, structural discrimination and racism. We also wanted to steer clear of the blame game. So, we're not struggling through this housing affordability crisis because of some bad actors. We're here because the market structures and the regulations enable what's become a really untenable misalignment between average market rents and average earnings, particularly for low to moderate income earners. And so, just financialization is not illegal necessarily. And so, as we say in the report, existing market structures within the rental market are at odds with an affordability imperative. And so we didn't want to just kind of point the finger at that. We knew really from the beginning that we needed to stay solutions focused. And so we really started to look at, and our partners were really instrumental in helping us figure this out, but what progress had been made over the past decade. So we looked at that, and the report ends with a series of 11 policy and program recommendations really directed across sectors to help low-income tower residents make rent and access eviction prevention. We'll get into this later in the conversation, I'm sure. Encourage kind of maintenance of these units and affordability, and to strengthen the social infrastructure within these communities as well.
Fascinating stuff. I love the changes and how you describe that, and can't wait to hear about the recommendations. Before we get into recommendations, though, I want to know, with this awesome work that you did 10 years later, what were some of the key findings in doing the research, and were there any surprises?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think, as Isabel touched upon, as we were doing this research, we knew that things had gotten worse, but we really wanted to understand the extent to which. And then we were also able to do that comparison in Peel and York, right? So this work has started in Toronto. And so we were able to expand that geographical reach and look a little bit deeper. And so what we were able to see is that, yes, there are those continued structural issues that continue in the towers in York as well as in Peel. Really major issues like plumbing issues, electrical wiring issues, and aspects that really make it uncomfortable to live, going back to the importance of completing this report to highlight those issues. So what we learned was that even though we know that there are a lot of structural issues and major repairs that are required, that these places are still really, they're really sought after by those individuals who are low and moderate income, because they are relatively affordable. They're more affordable than other types of housing. So this is why individuals who are struggling financially are likely to look to this type of housing to house their families. So when we were looking across, we were able to see that in terms of those inadequate housing conditions, that there are about 30,000 households across the region who are living in those inadequate conditions. So we're living in towers and units that require those really major structural repairs and those upgrades to plumbing. We also know that, especially thinking about, as Isabel touched on, as we were thinking about this report and the conditions and suitability of these towers, that we know that there are a lot of individuals who are almost doubling up, and there are multiple people living in really crowded conditions. So we know that within these towers, because they're affordable, we might have families who are more than one family who might have been intended to live in this particular unit might join another family just so that they can manage the costs. We know that that the impact that can have on when there are more than one family or more people in a particular unit that's intended, it becomes really stressful from a physical point of view. We know through COVID, the closer we are in proximity to other individuals, that we might be able to be transferring illnesses more easily. So that aspect of space really becomes an issue, and needing to have more space. And we can't see that in the towers in these situations. We also know that the psychological stress and distress that can happen when individuals are overcrowded in a space, when there's just not enough, there isn't that quiet corner where you just need to kind of decompress at the end of the day. But they're affordable, so families end up staying there despite the fact of their family size, even if they don't have enough bedrooms for their children. They might just stay there because it is a place that they can afford. And so that kind of brings us to the affordability aspect. When we look across and we see the actual amount that individuals are spending, we know that these particular units are on average about 13% cheaper to live in than other housing types and other rental types. So on average, it's about $142 in the GTA in terms of that savings that individuals that are living in these particular towers are going to get. So again, it's really that affordable aspect compared to other household types. Which brings us more to when we start thinking about the income levels of these particular tenants. We know that many of the tenants in these units they're really struggling to make ends meet. So about 49%, almost half of these renters are considered to be low income, meaning that they're earning on average about $39,000 before tax. And the study period that we looked at, looking at those trends between 1980 to 2015, we're able to see, and Isabel touched on this as well, that when we look at the income levels of high-rise renters compared to homeowners, we know that there's about a 5% increase in that time period in terms of the income levels that renters were acquiring compared to homeowners over that same time period. So when we start thinking about the budgetary trade-offs and decisions that households are going to have to make, when you only have that 5% increase versus that 41% increase, we know that it's going to be a lot easier, likely for those households to be making those decisions when it comes to, for household owners to be making decisions around food costs, transportation costs, medical costs, when we compare those to high-rise renters. And what we also saw through this research is when we're thinking about affordability, the generally accepted threshold is that 30% threshold, that if you're spending 30% or more on your household income on shelter costs, then that is considered to be unaffordable. So what we saw over that time period is that not only are we seeing more households who are in that 30% threshold, but also an increase of those who are in that 50% threshold, who are spending more than their household income, 50% of their household income on shelter costs. And so that really does start speaking to the deep unaffordability issue that we're seeing across our region, and that increase over time. So a really deeply concerning trend as well. And then finally, Isabel touched on this, the importance of having that disaggregated data. We were able to take a look to see the impact that, or who really is affected from an ethnographic perspective. We were able to see that racialized individuals are more likely to be low income, they're more likely to be a part of the working poor, and to experience housing insecurity and instability compared to non-racialized groups. So 47% of all racialized renters live in a high-rise apartment. The highest proportion would be Black at 55%, Filipino at 53%, and then South Asian at 48%. And then we also see that over that 35-year time period, that there's been an increase of about 40% of legacy towers, these high-rise towers that are actually located in low-income neighborhoods. So again, we see this as a really concerning trend to see that 40% over those 3 decades of that low-income threshold. And then what we can also know from all of this is that this means that what we're seeing is that racialized renters are not only more likely to be segregated by housing type, but also by neighborhood, because we're much more likely to find these towers, again, in low-income neighborhoods. So these were some of the surprising, or some of the trends that we found. And I think, as Isabel noted, we knew some of this before, but it really brought it home when we could actually see the proportion and especially the deep unaffordability, and how much that has changed, and that very, very concerning trend over time.
Important information that your research has found that I think, backs up a lot of what we know anecdotally. And I also think it kind of echoes across Canada. So I'm based out in Vancouver. And when you were talking about that affordability piece, it was reminding me of this article that came out in just September, where the city of Vancouver deemed affordable a 3-bedroom rental going for $3,600 in East Vancouver. When you go to West Vancouver, which tends to be a little bit more high-end, like luxury homes and so on, it's like $4,000. And so, when you think about the kind of income level you need, if you're a family with, one parent, you have 1 or 2 kids, I just think, and then given the when you're talking about sort of like desegregated data and the impact on communities that are racialized, I just think, we're continuing to see this problem in Vancouver mount as well. So I think the learnings from the GTA are really, really excellent. And so given all of these findings that you talked about, Trisha, Isabel, I was wondering if you can step us through kind of what you talked or mentioned before about what the recommendations are coming out of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll just, before I get into the recommendations, because Stefania, you referenced the title at the beginning, and I don't think we've actually defined kind of what we mean by legacy towers. So we're really talking about these older, purpose-built, high-rise. I mean, some of them are mid-rise because it's 5 stories or more towers built before 1985. And the reason they're called legacy is they are the legacy of federal incentive programs that were in place through the 60s and 70s that really helped build this rental stock across Canada. And so our report is focused squarely on the GTA, but I think a lot of the kind of trends are similar and similarly relevant to other jurisdictions, including Vancouver and other cities across the country. So I just wanted to slip that into the conversation as well. In terms of the recommendations, as I referenced earlier, there are 11 policy and program recommendations. It was hard to hone it down to those 11 because there are so many more. And so maybe just another comment to make is that this work exists as part of a much broader kind of contribution to solutions to our affordable housing crisis. And so these 11 recommendations we break out into 3 buckets in the report, and we do that to make them comprehensible, but they really do need to be thought of holistically and working together to make change. And before I jump into the 3 buckets, I should say, and we do reference this in the report, that the recommendations build off a really excellent foundation of existing research, some pilot projects and actions advanced across sectors, both public and private, over the past decade. And so there is a kind of a much broader movement, and this report and United Way is operating within a much broader ecosystem of people working in this space. So in our report, the first bucket of recommendations is really focused on strengthening financial and structural supports for low-income legacy tower residents. The reasons are because of what Trisha just outlined in terms of the vast disproportionalities and the vast, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, but the gaps between the incomes that people are earning and the cost of rent. And so we include recommendations to enhance the social safety net by modernizing EI and increasing, again, this is Ontario focused, but Ontario's social assistance rates to account for increased costs of living. We include recommendations to expand and improve access to eviction prevention services. And there's one that I think has really extremely high potential for immediate impact in communities. We include a recommendation to amend the Residential Tenancies Act to regulate rents on vacant units for existing rental housing. So essentially, we're calling for the end of vacancy decontrol policies that enable and allow building owners to increase rent by any amount between tenants. The second bucket is focused on strengthening the physical infrastructure of these buildings themselves. So these are the more traditional, quote unquote, tower renewal type of recommendations. And so looking at changes to existing repair and renewal programs to incentivize uptake by private building owners. Several programs exist, but the uptake is low. And so we think that there are probably some tweaks and changes to make them more accessible for these private building owners, which is really the focus of the report. We call for joint federal, provincial, municipal funding for demonstration projects in private towers that can really act as models of what is possible, and calls to enhance or develop new building standard bylaws and proactive enforcement programs that mandate things like development of a capital repair and electrical management plan, which I quite honestly, before digging into this research, thought was mandated, but it's not like that in all of the jurisdictions. And finally, the third bucket is focused on strengthening the social infrastructure within legacy tower communities, because ultimately there are people who live in these buildings. And so we know that culturally responsive and relevant social infrastructure is really critical to building sense of place, as Trisha kind of referenced in her response to what home means to her. We know that this is critical also for social capital connections, as we discussed last time I was on your podcast. And the infrastructure really needs to be place-based, resident-driven to ensure that these spaces and services are reflective of resident visions and aspirations. And so with this in mind, we call for expanded access to culturally relevant community services in Tower communities. We call for support for placemaking initiatives, tenant organizing, as well as support for neighborhood social development plans or other inclusive community-centered neighborhood improvement plans really focused on engaging residents in the planning and revitalization process. And I'll just end by saying, while resident engagement really comes out strongest in this third bucket of policy priorities around social infrastructure within these communities, engagement with residents is and consultation with community members is required really across all of the policy buckets. And engagement with people with lived experience of housing discrimination and housing insecurity to really ensure that they are that the solutions are meeting people's needs and aspirations.
Those are all very reasonable and doable. Awesome recommendations. Speaking of the doing part of it, what can be done to address the issues you outline regarding the availability and adequacy of the units?
Yeah, so I can take that one. I think what we really want to make sure that we're doing is, as Isabel outlined, that we've proposed kind of like 3 different buckets, but what we want to make sure is that we're looking at all of those recommendations holistically, that we recognize that they all need to happen and they need to happen kind of in coordination and collaboration with each other. So we want to make sure that we're involving all the different actors, the different sectors that can really optimize those partnerships and relationships to advance the work. And we found that is often when we have the most success, is when we have a whole bunch of different people, different brains coming to the table to really to think through how they can advance that work. And so through the recommendations, we've also kind of identified who can do what and how we can advance that. So hopefully those cross collaborations will continue to come into effect, and we hope to continue to play a role to make sure that the recommendations do become enacted. So that's one thing that needs to happen. Another that needs to happen is definitely to ensure and to continue taking that equity lens to the work that we're doing. We spent through the report, we do talk about, as I mentioned in my previously, that we do look at that disaggregated data. So we definitely see, which pockets of the population are being most impacted with this particular issue. And so what can we do by taking that equity lens? We can really work to address some of the structural and systemic issues that we know exist within our community, and really kind of address those barriers by taking that particular equity focused lens to the work. And the other thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is, we definitely recognize we want to make sure that we're taking a 2-pronged approach, because we recognize that, building more affordable housing, we completely support that and want to make sure that happens. But we also want to make sure, as this report outlines, is that we want to maintain this stock. This is, an asset to our region. So we want to make sure that we're taking that 2-pronged approach, where we're protecting what we have, we're maintaining what we have, updating it and upgrading to the extent that we can, and as well as building new. So those are kind of the 3 things that we think that should really happen in order to address some of the issues that we outlined throughout the report.
So let's talk about impact a little bit. You put all this work in this report. We've got recommendations. What do you hope the impact of this work will be? Talked about legacy too.
Yeah, no pressure. For me, the North Star is always social change. And so in a sense, it starts with changing cultural norms and mindsets around what we as a society think is acceptable. So with regards to housing affordability and the equity lens that's so important for us to kind of layer on top of this, we need to cement the belief really across all sectors, that decent, secure, affordable housing is a fundamental human right for everybody, regardless of income, regardless of immigration status, etc. So in that sense, I mean, I hope that first, I hope people pick up and read the report, and I hope that it can be leveraged and really utilized by community advocates, by decision makers, by policymakers, to help action the recommendations in support of fairer, more equitable housing conditions for all. Because again, like I said earlier, this is really about improving the living conditions of people within these towers, and making sure that people can have that kind of pride of place and pride of home. Sure, they can find the report on the United Way Greater Toronto website. So that is unitedwaygt.org. It's a recently refreshed website, so if you haven't been there for a bit, you might notice that it looks a little bit different. You can head to the Work tab and scroll to the bottom, and you'll find access to all of our reports there.
That's awesome. And because this report is so great, I know Michael and I are both very curious what you folks are working on now that we can look forward to.
Yeah, I can touch upon some of the work that we're hoping to do, and then I'll turn it over to Isabel. But I think what we're hoping to do is really maintain a lot of momentum with this report, to continue to do kind of engagement sessions, to do some more knowledge mobilization around the contents of the report, continue to reach out to different actors to make sure that this work kind of stays on the agenda, on the focus, and that we make sure that it's a part of the housing solution in our region. So that's kind of the work that I'm going to be focused on over the next little while, is just continue connecting with different individuals about this issue.
Yeah, and then maybe I'll add in, it's non-housing related, but we are in the midst of some case study research really aimed at harvesting innovations made by social service agencies during the pandemic. It's an exciting piece of work for me and from my perspective, because it really is attempting to identify some best practices relevant to other practitioners across the sector. We're aiming to have these ready by the spring, and we'll share them widely. So I think there's a lot of learning and supporting of kind of, what people reference, just like the modernization of the sector, to be gleaned through those case studies.
Well, listen, this work is outstanding. It's so important. Both Trisha and Isabel, you could have sat back and said, hey, my work is done, dropped the mic and walked away. No one would have blamed you, but you are far from doing that. You are turning up the pace and continuing to do important, impactful work. We're so grateful to have you on the show. Grateful for you bringing this forward and sharing it widely. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Really, really glad to be here. I'm happy to talk about our research anytime.
Thanks again. That's great.
Well, Michael, that was, another really amazing conversation. And, when we're talking about these, legacy buildings that have been around for quite some time, and if folks have been living there since, they were built, that really is home to them. And I think it gets really tough when we're building, new buildings like in Vancouver, and rent is considered affordable at $3,700 for a 3-bedroom. Like, it's just wild. How can people... No wonder they're, continuing to go back to where rent is, as Trisha noted, like 13% cheaper, right, than other buildings. It's keeping people in a tough situation.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think that I picked up from this too is that we're so forward focused sometimes on we need to create new affordable housing, we need to build new affordable housing, that we forget about the current affordable housing stock that we have that this report shows is decaying, is falling apart, is not adequate anymore, and reinvesting in that as well. And we saw that with, say, Toronto Community Housing, where they had, God, I remember, it was probably billions of dollars worth of backlog repairs. So if you don't pay attention to that, you're actually sliding backwards. You're not keeping up, you're not building new affordable housing because you're losing more than you're building, and it's important. These towers are important. They are home for people. They are affordable or more affordable. I always got to be careful with that, but more affordable. This is important work, and let's hope that all the recommendations are picked up and acted on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we know that there's that difference between affordability and deeply affordable, and I think we always need to be mindful of that when we're looking to kind of add to the units, because obviously there's also a scarcity, and I think reports like this, like you mentioned, are just really critical when we start looking ahead and planning ahead. So I thought it was great having them on the show, and yeah, I guess I will see you next week.
Yes, listen, we're off to a great start with this for 2022, and guaranteed it just keeps getting better and better. There are wonderful people out there, both experts and lived experts, doing great work. They'll all be on the way home. Whether you're listening to this in your home or on your way home, we thank you. Subscribe, share, and we'll see you next time. See you then, Steph.